In the last video, we looked at the growth of the town in the Middle Ages. Now, outside of the town system was feudalism. Feudalism was the dominant political and military institution during the Middle Ages. Most people in the Middle Ages lived in feudal society. But what was feudalism? Well, before we answer that, we have to talk about what was going on before feudalism. Now, after the fall of the Roman Empire, there was increasing fighting and chaos going on between the fierce Germanic groups. The Franks eventually became the dominant Germanic tribe, and that period can be divided into two ruling dynasties, the Merovingians and the Carolingians. Eventually, the Carolingians took over and were able to conquer a territory so large that it became an empire in its own right. And so there was a return to central authority. But the Frankish Empire was facing increasing threats. The first problem came from within, and that is the Frankish king always split his lands between all of his sons. This had the effect of creating separate kingdoms that were each competing with each other. But other threats, and perhaps even more serious threats, started to emerge from the outside, especially from the Vikings, the Hungarians, and other Slavic groups. These factors combined contributed to the eventual collapse of the Frankish Empire, and more importantly, the collapse of a central authority. And with that, feudalism began to fill in the void. So feudalism was a very, very local affair. You didn't have a concept of a nation. There was no France, there was no Germany. So if you were alive in the Middle Ages and someone asked you where you lived, you wouldn't have said France. You would have said, I'm from Flanders or the Loire or whatever province you lived in. So there wasn't this idea of nationalism. That didn't occur until around the time of the 100 Years' War. So feudalism was really a natural response to the collapse of the Frankish Empire. It was needed for protection since there was no longer an imperial or national army that could provide security. Instead, protection was provided by the local noble. So as I said, after the fall of the Franks, the nobles became more and more powerful, and the kings had less power. And so the noble had more power over his domain than any king or emperor. And the people looked to this local lord for protection, not from the king. So that's really the key to understanding feudalism. Power is with the local lord, not the king. What magnified this was the breakdown of the roads that we talked about in the last lecture. And what do bad roads mean? Less communication between the territories. And that also makes it harder to move armies around, especially over long distances. The Romans understood this all too well. Their highway system was primarily put in place to have the ability to move their legions around as fast as possible. Now, another factor involves one of the most important aspects to any army, and that is money. Armies require money, and a lot of it. With the collapse of an empire, there is a reduction in available currency. So that means no money to pay and equip your national army. So how do you pay your troops? Through land. And that is the basis of feudalism. Land for loyalty. And so if you were a king or great noble, how do you get the nobles under you to stay loyal? You granted them land. So feudalism at its core was about lords and the fief they provided. The fief was the land grant provided from a greater lord. So there were the fief holders and there were the greater lords that provided them. So the greater lords provided the fief, and in return the lesser noble promised to provide military service when he was called upon. And the lesser noble was called the vassal. Now that lesser noble in turn could split up his lands, and on and on and on until you get down to the individual knights. Now, only nobles could be a lord, and a greater noble could control several territories with a bunch of lesser nobles under him. Many of the greater nobles were called barons. Now, in theory, the king ruled over all of these nobles, but in reality, the king exercised little power over them during feudal times. And the main reason being that the king did not possess a very powerful national army. The nobles again had all the power at the local level. Now, when a vassal died, he was allowed to pass his lands on to his oldest son. The new vassal was still obligated to receive permission from his greater noble and to swear loyalty to that noble. This oath was an oath of fealty, which meant faithfulness. The control of the fief was then given to the lesser noble. Now I should point out that technically the greater noble owned the fief and the grant to the land, but in reality the lesser noble really kept control of his land. And that's why the lesser noble was able to pass it on to his oldest son. Now let's take a look at class structure in feudal times. Birthrights were very important in feudal Europe. The upper class, of course, were the nobles, but also a large portion of the clergy formed part of the upper class. The largest class were the peasants, and the peasants made up around 80 to 90% of the population. The peasants themselves also can be divided, which we will get to in a little bit. Now, the feudal lord often hired a steward to oversee his lands. This is because the noble really didn't want to bother himself with the day-to-day activities of his lands. So basically, this steward ran the show. He knew what was coming in and what was going out in terms of agricultural production. He also would have been in charge of almost all of the noble's finances, so he was a very, very important person on the noble's lands. There were also numerous other people under the steward: reeves, bailiffs, and even foremen. At the lowest end of the class hierarchy, as I mentioned, were the peasants. There were two types of peasants: the freemen and the serfs. The freemen owned some land, and the key here is they could leave the lord's land if they desired. Serfs could not own land and were not permitted to leave the lord's estate. In reality, though, the serf was looked at as the owner of the land he worked on, even though it was technically the lord's. Now, the serfs produced food for themselves, but they were required to provide a few days' output to the noble. The primary crop produced by the peasant was wheat, and these were divided into bushels. The amount of bushels produced depended on how many acres the peasant controlled. There was rarely a surplus since the estate did not have a market like towns. Peasants also would have been involved in herding and any extra work that was needed on the lord's estate. This might have involved repairing roads or even buildings. Now, all peasants, whether freemen or serfs, lived in villages. These often were a series of very small houses clumped together. And so if you had visited one of these villages in medieval times, you wouldn't have noticed a huge difference between freemen and serfs. They pretty much performed the same activities. Now, these villages would have been very close to the noble's manor house or castle. For their house, the peasant was obligated to pay rent to their lord. Now, the lord was the law in his domain, and a sort of court would have been set up on his lands. It was often presided over by the noble himself, and so this was another key aspect of noble power. They controlled the courts, and anytime you have control over the law, you have immense power. So during feudal times, a lord and his lands were completely self-sufficient. It produced all the produce needed and maintained its own society. And of course, it was the noble who was responsible for providing protection to all of the people under his dominion. The professional soldier in feudal Europe was the knight. Only nobles, whether greater or lesser, could attain knighthood. Peasants were not allowed to become knights. Now, training for a knight started early in a man's life. First, they became a page as a young boy. This duty was almost always performed in the castle of the knight that the page trained under. So before anyone could become a knight, they had to first train with an existing knight who served as their mentor. Now, after serving as a page, the young man would become a squire. This usually occurred at the age of 14. The squire traveled with the knight wherever he went. The squire often prepared the knight for battle and would help attach his multiple pieces of armor. Sometimes a squire would fight along with the knight in battle. After serving as a squire, a man could join the knighthood. When that day came, an elaborate ceremony was usually held. The knight would kneel before the altar, sometimes for hours in silence. He would often place his weapon on the altar for a blessing. He was then given 3 strokes with a sword from an older knight to complete the process. The knight also would take whatever oaths were required. Later on, this ceremony was administered by the church, adding a religious significance to the event. Now, if you take a look at this 19th century depiction here, you will see that this knight is receiving a blow, and that also was part of the process. Now, this blow wouldn't kill you, but it was a rather stout blow, and it was probably the only blow that the knight never returned, but it was designed to show the knight's loyalty and discipline. Now, chivalry was a key component to knighthood. And this was almost like a code of honor for the knight. And how was the knight expected to act? Knights were expected to protect the weak and to defend women. He was also expected to show absolute loyalty to his greater lord. And of course, there was loyalty to an even higher cause, the church. That meant protecting the church whenever the knight was called upon to do so. Another aspect for the knight involved attending tournaments and various other duties. Now, in reality, few knights attained all of these virtues, but it was sort of held up as a model throughout the Middle Ages. But as I said, it was difficult for knights to attain all of these virtues, since after all, these knights were professional soldiers. So many times they pillaged other nobles' lands and looked upon war booty as a way to make money. So sins were committed, and that is why the Crusades offered the knight a way to attain salvation. Salvation for the many sins they had to commit when they had to pillage other lands. If there was a battle, the knight always made up the cavalry. These battles usually were very local and usually consisted of a conflict against another feudal lord. The knight was called upon to serve his greater lord against another enemy lord. Knights were supposed to serve without fear or cowardice. In battle, usually the peasants made up the foot soldiers. They usually were sent in first, so peasants usually suffered the most casualties in these engagements. After the infantry came the cavalry charge. The knight almost always charged first with a lance or a spear. After this, the spear was ditched for close quarter fighting. Here, the knight would likely use a sword or even a battle axe. The knights might fight other knights or mow down the peasant infantry. Now, the bane of all knights was the bow and arrow. Archers were looked upon as cowards by the knights. Now, a charge against a peasant foot soldier was easy enough, and almost always successful, but ranged weapons presented a problem for the knight. Initially, bows were too weak to give the knights much trouble, but eventually ranged weapons got more and more powerful, especially with the introduction of the crossbow. Crossbows could achieve a great amount of penetration, and this made the chainmail armor that knights wore pretty much obsolete, so the knights were forced to turn to plate armor. Eventually, the advent of gunpowder and high-powered cannons made the cavalry charge increasingly irrelevant in warfare. Now, if knights were captured, they were usually ransomed for money. Non-knights were almost always executed since they had no money for ransom. Okay, that is going to do it for this video. In the next video, we are going to look at the noble and the castles that they built.